Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this evening's event. My name is Rachel Siglo, and I am the Deputy Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. And I'm here to welcome you tonight on behalf of our partners at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum and Library and our partners, the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I know it was a little rainy and maybe drizzly to get here, but we appreciate you being here, and we are looking forward to tonight's speaker. Thank you. Erica?
Good evening. So welcome to our fifth program in the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's Great Decisions series that examines topics on world issues selected by the Foreign Policy Association. I'm Erica Kubik, the Director of Programming for the Council, and on behalf of my colleagues, Rachel Brooks, Abigail Stead, and Michael Van Denen, as well as the Board of Directors, thank you for being with us tonight. It's our mission to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. To change the world, we believe one must first know the world. And you can learn more about what we do and who we are at worldmichigan.org. We're pleased to host the Great Decisions series at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, and deeply grateful to the museum staff and to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for this partnership and support. Thank you as well to the GRCC and museum video teams for their expertise enabling our live stream broadcast. We express our appreciation to WGVU Public Media and to the Community Media Center as communication partners. And now let me introduce our speaker for this evening. Ghaith al-Omari is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship and former Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine. He served as advisor to the negotiating team during the 1999 to 2001 permanent status talks, in addition to holding various other positions within the Palestinian Authority. In that capacity, he participated in various negotiating rounds, most notably the Camp David Summit and the Taba talks. After the breakdown of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, he was the lead Palestinian drafter of the Geneva Initiative, an official model peace agreement negotiated between leading Palestinian and Israeli public figures. Mr. al-Omari is a lawyer by training and a graduate of Georgetown and Oxford universities. Prior to his involvement in the Middle East peace process, he taught international law in Jordan and was active in human rights advocacy. Tonight's program is sponsored by Ferris State University and the City of Holland. Please join me in welcoming Mr. al-Omari.
Hi, good evening. Do you hear me in the back? Excellent. First of all, thank you, Erica. Thank you, World Affairs Council, Michael, Rachel, for having me here. It's really, really an honor. I mean, this is amazing. Thank you for your introduction, Rachel. It's almost daunting standing in the museum here with the legacy of President Ford kind of in the background. A legacy of internationalism, of engagement, both with the world, but also across differences. And I think these are values that are so key to us today, and unfortunately often values which are missing today. First of all, before I start, I'm often told by my wife that sometimes I speak too fast when I get excited, and I will get excited later on in the conversation. So if I'm speaking too fast, just, wave me and let me ask me to slow down. Now, I have to say, when I first agreed to Erica's invitation to come and speak about the Middle East in transition, I did not really know what I was walking into. I thought, one or two transitions, I can handle that. I look at the Middle East today. It's in one of the most fluid moments that I have seen it since at least 1979. So much is changing. So much is changing in countries, specific countries, in the kind of geostrategic map, in relations between different actors. I will not have, within 30 minutes, I will not have time to go through everything, obviously. I will try to focus on three issues, and I will take them from the order of most depressing to least depressing, are the issues that we are facing in the Middle East. And since we are in transition, and I truly believe in transition in that region, I'm not sure I will be able to offer you answers, but maybe I will offer you some of the questions that we have to think of. We're talking about decisions. I want to maybe present some of the decisions that leaders have to make in order to see where we're heading next. And as I said, I will focus on three main themes, three main issues. One, the obvious one, the Gaza war. Where are we? Where are we going from here? Second, I will focus on the issue of Iran. What is happening with the Iranian file, both nuclear and the other regional activities of Iran. And finally, and maybe to end with a bit of good news, I will talk about some of the changes in the Middle East, what's happening in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and things of this sort, and conclude with a couple of words, which really, I guess, the most relevant to us here, is what does that mean to the United States, and how can the United States best take advantage of some of these opportunities, as well as guard, obviously, against some of the threats that come from the transitions. So let me start with Gaza. And here, I'm going to have to say, I am very pessimistic in the short term. As all of you know, there is a ceasefire in Gaza, a ceasefire that was negotiated by the Biden team. President Biden basically announced the ideas that became a ceasefire back in May of last year. But it was pushed across the finish line by President Trump and his negotiator, Steve Witkoff. I think this is a case where both administrations deserve credit for what we have. Now, the ceasefire is one that actually follows a very familiar pattern in diplomacy. Many of us as diplomats, as negotiators, when we have a very difficult problem set ahead of us, what we often choose to do is to basically say, okay, the easy parts, and by the way, just to be clear, when I say easy, this is the Middle East, so easy is very relative. But the easy part here is the question of what we call phase one in the deal. And this is something that did not require either party, Hamas or Israel, to make any fundamental strategic decisions. The deal with phase one, which ended last week, was about basically Hamas handing over some of the hostages that it took after the brutal terrorist attack of October 7th. And in exchange, Israel hands over a number of Palestinian prisoners. The difficult questions were deferred to phase two, which is where we are right now. And this is where I am pessimistic. Phase two, both sides will have to answer basic strategic questions, and their interests are simply diametrically opposite. On the Israeli side, their view is we cannot end the war unless Hamas is completely defeated. Footnote, what does completely defeated mean? It's not very clear to me, nor have they articulated what that actually means. Prime Minister Netanyahu talks about total victory. Nice slogan, translated to policy, it's not very clear what it means. But at the end of the day, they don't feel that the time is right to end the war until Hamas is out of the picture. For Hamas, they have a very different set of interests. For Hamas, their interests, what they're saying, we're not going to give up the rest of the hostages, our only leverage, unless we get guarantees that Israel is going to get out of Gaza, there'll be an end of the war, and we remain in power. Very hard to see how you can reconcile those, and these are not reconcilable. And I genuinely fear that we are going to go into a resumption of the war very, very soon. And I'm fearful not only because I don't see what different Israel can do now that it has not done in the last 15 months to shift the direction of the war. I'm also fearful because wars do have a human impact. I will not dwell on the human cost of this war, enough to say that the Israelis remain traumatized from the atrocities of October 7th, and the Palestinians remain traumatized by the excesses of the Gaza war. Prolonging it will not help any of the two sides heal and to even start digesting the trauma that they went through. Be that as it may, I do believe that ultimately we're going into a resumption of the war. Yet, this war, like all wars, is going to end. No war lasts forever. Where I think we all failed, and by we, I include everyone in terms of the international community, is to plan of what to do once the war is over. What we call in Washington lingo, the day after. And here, everyone has failed. You know, I would go to Israel, I do that often, and I would talk to Israeli military and intelligence officials, and they have actually done a lot of a fair bit of planning in terms of the day after. Yet there's a political decision by the Prime Minister not to do integrated planning in Israel. So you have a lot of tracks of planning, nothing integrated, and therefore there is no Israeli plan for a day after. Netanyahu is doing this for his own political reasons. I can get into those in the Q&A. But basically, Israel has not, as a state, has not planned for the day after. But Israel is not the only one here that has dropped the ball. The Arab countries have also dropped the ball. I would go to Arab capitals, Riyadh, Amman, Cairo, etc., talk to officials and ask them, okay, what's your plan for the day after? And they will respond with slogans. We want a two-state solution. We want the Palestinian Authority to come and govern Gaza. Now, by the way, personally, I agree with those slogans. I do believe that the only solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a two-state solution. Again, happy to get into that in the Q&A. I do believe that ultimately only the Palestinians can govern Gaza and only the Palestinian Authority has the legitimacy to govern Gaza. Yet these are not answers to the very immediate, very complex problems that the war in Gaza presents. These require more concrete questions or answers. I would argue since last October, a few months ago, 5 months ago, we've been in a stalemate when it comes to where to move after the war. Enter Donald Trump. Trump comes and he presents this idea, I wouldn't call it even a plan, of the Riviera of the Middle East. Let's get rid of all of the Gazans, put them out of Gaza, and let's build a big, beautiful resort. And if you don't believe it, go and look at the thing that he tweeted or X'd or whatever the term is right now, where an AI-generated short video shows you exactly how beautiful it is, a lot of gold and Trump statues and all of the above. Now, on the merits of it, if you look at this idea on the merits of it, it's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea from, in my view at least, from a moral point of view. You just don't move people like this. I'm a believer that if some Gazans want to leave for humanitarian reasons, and I'm sure many do, given the hell that Gaza is today, they should be allowed to leave. But moving people forcibly? No, there is something immoral about that. Nor is it a practical idea. What are you going to do with these people? You're going to go and go in with machine guns and put them on trucks and move them out, and then if you move them out, who's going to take them? The Egyptians are not going to do it. The Jordanians are not going to do it. Impractical and reckless in the sense that if it gets implemented, it hits at the stability of some of our key security partners in the region. Destabilizing Jordan, destabilizing Egypt will not accrue to the interest, obviously, of the Jordanians and the Egyptians, nor to Israel, nor to American interest. So if you look at it purely on its merits, it is, I would say, a terrible idea. However, if you look at it as a negotiating tactic, it's actually producing some results. When President Trump said it, frankly, Arab countries got scared. And the same Arab officials who a month ago were basically giving me slogans are now talking in very specific, concrete terms of what they can do to counter this idea and to present their own real ideas for Gaza the day after. So much so that actually today, Arab leaders met in Cairo in an Arab League summit, and they produced some ideas of how to move forward. I have not read yet the final communique, it just came out. Yet, to my mind, for any plan for the day after Gaza to be meaningful and successful, it has to answer 4 questions. First question, what do you do about the physical reconstruction of Gaza? This, by the way, is the easiest question. Again, easiest in Middle Eastern terms. It's the easiest because this is a mechanical question. It's a question of funding, it's a question of machinery, hardware that moves rubble, builds buildings. As long as you give a realistic time frame, and a realistic time frame is not what we hear about 3 to 5 years, at least a decade, 15 years, this can be done. It gets very complicated when you get to the other issues, because these are political and security issues that have to be answered. And the first one is, what do you do with Hamas? My own view, there is no future for Gaza as long as Hamas remains in power. Obviously, Hamas remaining in power, directly or indirectly, and focus on indirectly because that's what Hamas is trying to do. The Israelis will not accept it, the US will not accept it, and most importantly, key Arab countries will not accept it. Countries like the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia have said, we will not put a penny in Gaza if Hamas is still in power. Partly because they are against Hamas, but partly because they believe that if Hamas remains in power, it's only a matter of time till we get another war. And those countries are saying, we're not going to lose our investment again in Gaza. So Hamas cannot be in power. However, Hamas probably disagrees with this position. Okay. So how do you deal with Hamas? How do you get rid of it? Using security means, using political means? Is there a space for integration of some members of Hamas, but not the top leadership? But this is the first set of questions, and it's complicated by the fact that within the Arab world, there is a lot of intra-Arab tensions. Some countries don't want to see Hamas. Others, like Egypt, believe that there is no realistic way to move forward without dealing with Hamas. Others want to support Hamas, like Qatar and like Turkey, which is not an Arab country, but it's kind of part of the region. But that's the first set of questions. The second set of questions, or the third rather, is what do you do about security? The idea that the Palestinian Authority should come and take over security is a very nice idea. Problem is today the Palestinian Authority, which is the governing authority for the Palestinians in the West Bank, cannot control the West Bank. How can you expect it to control the infinitely more complicated issue of Gaza? I was talking to an American three-star general who covers these issues just last week. And he was telling me that his professional assessment, it takes 3 to 5 years to train Palestinian security forces to be up to speed and to be up to, staffing and capabilities and equipping to deal with Gaza. So who takes care of security in these 3 to 5 years? You want Israel out? Who's willing to come in? The obvious one is, okay, Arab troops come in. Easy for us to say, in the same way that we in this country don't want to send our kids to go kill and die in a foreign war. Arab countries don't want to send their kids to go and die, kill and die in an Arab war. So in a foreign war. So ultimately, we have to come to a solution with this. My own belief here is that the Arab countries, if they want Israel out, they're going to have to take the risk of going in and assuming some security control until the Palestinian Authority comes in. And the fourth question, which relates to this, is about the Palestinian Authority itself. Well, I do believe that ultimately the Palestinian Authority needs to come and take over Gaza. The Palestinian Authority today does not lack or does not have the credibility or the capability to govern Gaza. It's discredited. Its public does not trust it. 80% of the Palestinian public believes the PA is corrupt. That's 4 out of 5 Palestinians you will meet believe their leaders are thieves. Unfortunately, these are my former bosses, but that is what it is. So what are we going to do about reforming, rehabilitating, cleaning up the Palestinian Authority to make it a compelling, convincing governing body for Gaza? Traditionally, Arab countries used to come to the US and say, you guys deal with it. Somehow I don't see this administration having the attention span or the bandwidth to deal with this. So the Arabs have to come up and say, if you really want the Palestinian Authority to come in, you have to do the heavy lifting, including pushing the current president out of the way, dealing with issues of corruption, all these kinds of issues. And this is where we are in Gaza right now. Today, no one has a plan. We have the beginnings of an Arab plan. They will present their proposal. Like any first proposal, it will be insufficient. That's normal. No one makes the first offer as their final offer. It will be interesting to see if the US is going to engage with the Arab countries to come up with something more functional and more working. So that's one. Gaza, unfortunately, depressing, short-term, a tragedy. Long-term, I'm not sure where it's going to go. Slightly more uplifting topic is Iran. And it's uplifting, what they say, happiness is more than the absence of pain. The question of Iran is it is the absence of pain, so maybe it's not just happiness. What do I mean by that? Iran represents two major, Let me take it a step back. Iran, in my view, is the biggest disrupting actor in the region. Willing to discuss it in the Q&A, but my view, it's the biggest destabilizing actor in the region. And it's destabilizing on two different arenas. One, the Iran's nuclear program, which they claim is civilian. No way on earth is that the civilian nuclear program. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency said recently, when you enrich 60%, there is no conceivable civilian use for 60% enrichment. That's only for weaponization. And the other question of Iran's use of proxies to project its power. Now, the good news, if I can call it good news, is that actually Iran right now is very vulnerable on both fronts. Many of you who followed the news would remember there was a couple of rounds of tit for tat between the Israelis and the Iranians, where the Iranians hit Israelis, the Israelis hit back, etc. The second Israeli attack was actually very significant in setting back Iran in strategic ways. In two ways. That attack basically destroyed Iran's Russian-supplied air defense system, the S-300s, destroyed the radar systems. Today, Iran's nuclear program is exposed to air attack. So the possibility of hitting it is there. It is a limited window because ultimately the Iranians will rebuild, but it's there. However, war is not, a picnic, as it were. War with Iran could be very complicated. Could be very complicated because even if you could hit Iran, and that in itself is complicated, it's difficult militarily, Iran has the capabilities to fire back, not only in Israel, but on key Arab allies, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, in ways that can destabilize not only the region, but the whole oil markets throughout the world. We will feel it here in Grand Rapids, in Washington. So I think in this one, Trump's instinct is right. We have to start by trying to get a deal with the Iranians. I personally doubt that they will give up their nuclear program, but you have to try diplomacy. But for diplomacy to be credible, it has to be backed by a credible threat of the use of force. Sometimes the best way to avoid a war is to make it clear that you are ready to go to a war if you need to. And this is a balance that is not very clear to me how we're going to strike at this moment. On Iran's regional destabilization, I also see some good news here. Iran tried to use the October 7th and the Gaza war as a vehicle to project its power. It really activated its proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, some of the militias in Iraq, etc. Well, to put it in technical terms, the Israelis really whacked them. Hezbollah has been not only decapitated, it's been drawn and quartered. It is a fraction of what it used to be. Its missile capabilities have been definitely reduced. It is certainly not out, but it is down. Hamas has been very heavily damaged. Actually, the militias in Iraq, interestingly, decided decided to wait this out because they felt they don't want to be hit the way that the Hezbollah was hit. So Iran's project has had a setback. The most significant setback that it had is what happened in Syria. In Syria, because of a series of events, there was no one trigger, but series of events led to the fall of the Assad regime. Assad regime that's been in power since 1971, and I have zero sympathy for the Assad regime. I'm shedding no tears. This is a brutal regime that killed its people in the most heinous, awful ways possible. My own view, may everyone of that family and of that regime rot in hell because they deserve it. It's a strategic move. I mean, again, the brutality of that regime was unthinkable. Yet, the new leaders of Hamas are not, the Arab branch of the Mother Teresa Association. These are people who have their foundation in ISIS and Al-Qaeda, people who have done, frankly, awful things, including the current leader, Ahmed al-Shara, personally done awful things. Yet since they came to power, they have been sending all the right signals. Protecting minorities, ensuring that women don't get forced to wear the hijab, saying we don't want a war with anyone, not Israel, not any of our neighbors, clamping down on the drug trade, which was a major issue there, etc., etc. So a challenge right now, if you want to keep the Iranians on their back foot, this one is how do you engage with the new Syrian regime? Because if the new Syrian regime gets firmly outside the Iranian orbit, Iranians cannot reconstitute Hezbollah, etc. You cannot resupply and rebuild Hezbollah by air. If you look at the map, you need Syria as a land corridor. Here, I think we have to balance. On the one hand, you cannot give a carte blanche to people who were just a few years ago Al-Qaeda. On the other hand, if you say you were once Al-Qaeda, we will never deal with you, and if we stonewall them, then ultimately these new leaders will end up moving back to the Iranian orbit and to the Russian orbit, because if you have no other choice, then you go to whoever is willing to give you money and weapons. So that's a big problem that for now, at least, whether here in this country or in Israel, I don't see a good policy. Some of the Arab countries are reaching out, trying to support the new regime, but they can only do so much if there is no sanction relief against that regime. So this is the second point. It is maybe not a happy point, but at least one of the negative aspects of negative players in the Middle East. Iran is right now reeling, unbalanced, and so we have an opportunity to deal with its nuclear program and to consolidate the defeat of its proxy network. And I left actually the only piece of good news till the very end, because actually there is good news. There is good news because the Arab world is changing fundamentally. Now, I look around the room, and I think it's not inaccurate to say that some of you have been following Arab politics for many years, some decades. And you will know that traditionally, Arab politics has been largely characterized by a heavy dose of ideology and a very light dose of good governance. If you look at what defined Arab politics really since the 1950s, it's been big ideologies. Pan-Arabism, a la Nasser of Egypt, a la Ba'ath Party of Iraq and Syria. Islamism, Muslim Brotherhood style, whether it is the Egyptian brand, the Syrian brand, etc. These are all political ideologies that basically saw legitimacy not as a function of what you offer to your public, but as a function of how fiery is your speech and how much you can push your ideological agenda and your sphere of influence. These ideological mindsets basically are a product of the Levant and Egypt. The Levant and Egypt were the center of the gravity of the Arab world, whether culturally, politically, etc. It was Cairo, Beirut, Damascus, etc. And with this center of gravity came the ability to project ideology and governance and political systems. Things are changing. Today, the center of gravity in the Arab world is in the Gulf. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. And these are countries that have a very, very different concept of what it means to govern and what it means to be legitimate. And their concepts, while highly undemocratic, and they will be the first to tell you, we are not Democrats, we never said we were Democrats, we don't want to be Democrats, yet they believe that a government should serve its public through providing personal security, prosperity, clean, effective, responsive governance, etc. This is the center of gravity, and we're seeing a totally different kind of politics emerging from there. If you look at the educational systems, for example, in Saudi Arabia, in United Arab Emirates, a departure from a grievance-based narrative to a future-based narrative. To put it in very, very kind of mild terms, when I go to Cairo for a couple of days, I come back depressed, needing a lot of alcohol and antidepressants. I go to Saudi Arabia, because everyone you talk to is complaining. There are grievances, etc., etc. It sucks the energy out of you. You go to Saudi Arabia, you go to UAE, and it is really energetic. You leave energized. There are people who are looking to the future. This is an opportunity. The Middle East is a region of risks and opportunities. This is all very interesting, at least in my view, to look at these kind of things. But what does it mean to us in the United States? Unfortunately, I would say in the United States, and I will conclude with this point, since the Obama administration, including the Obama administration, both terms, including the first Trump administration, and then the Biden administration, despite all of their differences, there was one theme. We want to exit the Middle East. The US wants to leave the Middle East because we see the Middle East as a place that produces nothing but headaches, problems, etc., etc. We overlearned, I believe, our lessons in Iraq and all of that. Today, in face of these transitions we see, in face of these threats and opportunities, we have to make a decision in this country. Are we invested in the Middle East or are we not invested in the Middle East? I fully understand why people don't want to be invested in the Middle East. It is a bit of a pain. It is sometimes frustrating to deal with the Middle East. However, I would say that if we do not get engaged in the Middle East, actually, I mean, this is true of everything. If you don't get engaged, you have no say in the way things are going to end up. We are out of the Middle East, then we will not be able to shape how these transitions are going to go. If we're not invested, not only financially, but also politically and militarily, then we will not be able to ensure that things end up with, towards our interest. If we are not engaged, and if our partners there know we're not engaged, they're going to start hedging. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing some of those countries unsure of what we're do what we're going to do, talk to China, talk to Russia, to others to see if anyone can fill this vacuum. And finally, I would say, we might decide to leave the Middle East. It doesn't mean that the Middle East will decide to leave us. And as we saw on October 7th, and as we saw often in the case, if we exit the Middle East, developments there will happen and they will draw us back in. October 7th forced us to go back in, not only to defend Israel, but also to defend navigation in the Red Sea, to defend our other key allies, etc., etc. So even if we start to leave, we might be dragged back in. But if you leave and you get dragged back in, you don't get dragged back in on your own terms. You get dragged back in a reactive way. And this is what we saw with the Biden administration. They came in, they were playing catch up. They were not prepared for that. So today, we're talking about big decisions. Today, the big decision, without which none of the above, none of the issues that I mentioned, Gaza, Iran, shifts in the Arab world, none of them can be shaped to our interests unless we decide whether or not to get engaged in the Middle East. And if we decide to get engaged in the Middle East, then we have to figure out how to invest the right amount of investment in, again, money, diplomacy, but also militarily, to remain the major actor in that region. With this, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I always say, look, I mean, I've been doing this business for around 30 years. You develop very thick skin when you do Middle East policy, meaning no question is off limits. It's on your mind, put it out there. I really would love to have this conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ghaith. Ghaith, thank you very much. Fascinating, huh? He really has a handle on some of these issues and can start the conversation off well. I'm Michael from the World Affairs Council. Erica and I will have microphones. You know our house rules. Ask your questions respectfully and succinctly. And so we can get as many questions in as possible. And Ghaith says, anything's fair game. So let's get that started.
You said the mood or attitude in the Middle East has been changing to one more forward-looking. Mm-hmm. What do you attribute that to?
I attribute it to a number of factors. One is actually the failure of the old ideologies. I mean, if you look at the Arab Spring, what we saw in the year 2011, maybe up to 2015, these public revolts. These were public revolts against the failure of an ideological system. People, when they took to the streets in Tunisia, in Egypt, and elsewhere, if you look at their slogans were not about liberating this and liberating Palestine and ending imperialism and all of these kind of, nice things that a lot of campus activists like to talk about here. Their slogans were about, we want bread, meaning the economy, we want freedom, we want social justice. meaning equality before the law, etc., etc. So the failure of these systems basically created this first pushback. This was followed quickly by the Muslim Brotherhood coming and taking over. The Muslim Brotherhood self-destructed in a very, very short time. A lot of big slogans, no actual plans of how to move forward. The space, the playing field was suddenly empty. This gave the chance to the Saudis and the Emiratis to come into the game. The Gulf in particular is an area that was seen traditionally, and I would say very condescendingly and insultingly, by other Middle Eastern countries, was seen as basically, oh, these are a bunch of Bedouins who have a lot of money, they're an ATM. And again, I mean, this was the attitude. Well, those Bedouins spent the last 30 years, 40 years, going to excellent universities, building amazing infrastructure, building wonderful, private sector, etc., etc., etc. When the old players came out of, got moved out of the way, those countries have come to their own and came and occupied this particular space. So this is, to me, what I attribute it to. And I find it very interesting. Look, in the Arab world today, we're talking about transition. We're still in transition. Some countries are there. Some countries are trying to get there. Other countries are fighting, trying to get there. Egypt, for example, still believes it's the center of the universe and cannot concede to the Saudis and to the Emiratis. And we see this in intra-Arab politics. The most encouraging, factoid, as it were, when it comes to this, is looking at something. There's a UN series of polls that's been going on for the last maybe 20, 25 years called the Arab Barometer. One of the questions they always ask to Arab countries, to the respondents is, do you want to emigrate out of your country? A majority of Arab youth want to immigrate. The second question is, where do you want to immigrate? Until 10, 15 years ago, everyone would say, London, Paris, New York, the West. 15 years ago, it started changing. Today, most young Arabs who want to immigrate don't want to go to the West. They want to go to Abu Dhabi, to Dubai, to Saudi Arabia, because these are countries that are creating models that are culturally relatable. When I go there, the music I listen to is music that I fully understand. The food that I eat is food that I actually appreciate, etc. So this is becoming the center of gravity right now, and it's gaining a lot of soft power in addition to the hard power that they have. So this is, as I see it, this is the transition. But again, there are a lot of pushback from the old Arab countries that just do not want to see the change and concede leadership, but also pushback from Iran that sees this change as threatening the Iranian regime. A very interesting, little story. Make of it what you will. A year or so ago, as one of the Saudi soccer teams, I mean, if you know, in that region, soccer is the big sport. One of the Saudi soccer teams who had just contracted a guy called Ronaldo, who apparently is a big soccer guy. I don't know soccer, but people tell me he is like, the Tom Brady or whatever the equivalent is here. So they go and play a match in Iran. And they enter the stadium, and in the stadium, the Iranians have the bust of Qasem Soleimani. The head of the Qasem Soleimani was the head of what is called the Quds Force, part of the Iranian IRGC, their military, etc., killed by the US a few years ago. And the Iranian soccer fans who were there were so angry and went and they basically broke the bust of Soleimani and saying, look, the Saudis are bringing us Ronaldo and you're bringing us Soleimani. So this model is actually threatening some of these countries. So there's a lot of pushback against this model. And this is one of the questions that we as a country need to come and engage. Because these countries, I drew a very rosy picture of some of these countries. They're far from perfect. We all remember the killing of that journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, someone that I knew personally. We remember this stuff. So it is not perfect. But again, if we engage, we can help direct, push, hug those people in the right direction in ways that ultimately can help us and maybe help them also avoid some of the excesses that they have done. If we remain unengaged, guess who's going to come in? The Chinese the Russians, and others. And let's just say that I would rather have an American influence on the Saudis rather than a Chinese influence on the Saudis.
I wonder if you could comment on the relationship, possible relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel and how that will affect the Middle East.
Oh, I certainly can. First of all, maybe some background. We all know, I mean, we've seen the news. Saudi Arabia and Israel had been in conversation before October 7th to reach a Saudi-Israeli normalization. This is a building up on the momentum created by the Abraham Accords, which under the first Trump administration were signed between Israel and 3 Arab countries, UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. Now, part of the reason why these peace treaties are happening, they're not actually peace treaties, these countries were never in actual war, but these normalization treaties are happening, is the shift that I just mentioned. These countries no longer look at the Middle East through an ideological lens in which Israel is anathema. They look at it from a basic national interest lens. Regional integration is good for business, is good for stability, etc. That's what's driving them. Before October 7th, there was a narrative in much of the Arab world, and this is what we saw in the Abraham Accords, that the Palestinian issue is passé. Yeah, that's yesterday's problem. And there was always a sense, and I heard this when I used to talk to officials in the Gulf, is that even if things flare up between Palestinians and Israelis, it's a containable local conflict. Let the Israelis and Palestinians fight it out, what do we care? Well, October 7th has shown that this is absolutely inaccurate. Inaccurate on 2 fronts, on 2 levels. One level, the fact that this could easily, this easily spilled over. What started as a local conflict ended up with, the Houthis closing the Red Sea to navigation. 30% of navigation of the world suddenly came to a halt. Destabilization of Jordan, threats against Saudi, etc. Suddenly those countries realized, oh, we cannot ignore the Palestinian issue. Secondly, the Gaza war has created a degree of affinity between young Arabs to the Palestinian issue that was not there a year and a half ago. I remember I was in Saudi Arabia, when was it? May of last year, last time I was there, having dinner with a bunch of people, including this young woman who is the poster child for the new Saudi Arabia. Perfect English, stylish, she was waiting for a visa to go to Shanghai to open up a branch of the business that she founded, which is about clean energy. And she loves Mohammed bin Salman. She said, without him, I would still be stuck at home, unable to drive, let alone have a business, blah, blah, blah. So I asked her, okay, great, fantastic. What do you think about the normalization with Israel? She said, before the war, I didn't care. Before the war, this was my parents' problem. What do I care? After the war, after the images that they're seeing coming out of Gaza, she said, I will never forgive the Israelis. A new generation has suddenly become activated with this conflict. Still, I do believe that the Saudis want normalization. That's what I'm hearing from very senior Saudis that I talk to regularly. The Israelis want normalization, but the conditions have become much more complicated. Already it was complicated. It was a 3-way deal. Saudi-Israeli normalization, but the Saudis, what they really wanted was a defense treaty with the United States. Today, it's very hard for me to see the Senate agreeing to anything. For a treaty, you need 67 votes. Yeah. Look at the Senate and tell me, can they agree on anything? Can you get 67 votes to agree whether it's day or night outside? So this is becoming very, very difficult. But also, I think for the Saudis, because of what I just said, the issue of the Palestinian issue, which was really just a footnote before October 7th, has become a priority. I do believe with time, though, we will get to Saudi-Israeli normalization. I do believe that it can be used as a bridge towards building an end to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. If we can go to the Israelis and say, get a peace with the Palestinians, by the way, once the Palestinians get their act together, because even I, as a Palestinian today, would not go into peace with the Palestinians when they're so divided, so dysfunctional, etc. But if the Palestinians get their act together, The Saudis can come and say, Israelis, solve the issue with the Palestinians and you will get peace with us. And if you get peace with the Saudis, then the floodgates will open. Every other Arab and Muslim country will come in. So it can be very transformational, but it requires decisions by the Saudis themselves, from us here, in terms of how much we're going to engage and invest with the Saudis, and by the Israelis, in terms of how much they're willing to move towards resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
I have a couple of questions regarding negotiations on governance and security in the case of a two-state solution. How do you believe that the concept of a Palestinian right of return will affect the negotiations? And as well, how could we expect Palestinians to react to the possibility of a governing authority other than Hamas in the case that Hamas contributes to a peace?
Okay. Let me start with the first one, which is the easier one. There can be no peace if there is right of return. Full stop. A peace deal would require the Palestinians and the Israelis each to make one core concession. On our side, we have to accept there is no right of return, and that's for a very basic reason. Israel was created for only one reason: to be the homeland of the Jewish people. Okay? The Jewish connection to the land is very deep. There is no denying it. The Jewish experience throughout history had taught Jews, if you don't have a state, you will remain vulnerable. And history has not been kind to the Jews. They need their own state to protect themselves. And frankly, they need their own state as well to be able to express their national identity through the way that they relate to, national symbols, national identity, etc., etc. Have the right of return, meaning the return of some 10 million Palestinian refugees to Israel. Israel is no longer a Jewish state, and therefore no state can be expected to to sign its own death warrant. So this is the major concession that we have to give. The major concession they have to give, the Israelis, is to accept that Jerusalem has to be divided. No division of Jerusalem, no peace with any Arab states. Now, these issues of Jerusalem and refugees are very complicated issues. Not the practicalities, by the way. In terms of the practicalities, we can easily find solutions. This is one of the most overstudied, overanalyzed, over-negotiated conflicts on earth. We know the practical solutions. Yet both of these issues are actually of great symbolic significance to both peoples. These are almost part of the identities of both peoples. Anyone who's familiar with the Jewish faith, let alone Zionism as a movement, will know that, Zion is a mountain in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a key part of the Jewish faith and the Jewish identity. So when I say you have to divide Jerusalem, it's not only a classical sovereignty diplomatic issue. No, you're asking them to give up a big part of their identity. Similarly, for us, the issue of refugees, the issue of the right of return is not only a physical, practical demand, it's part of our identity. This is how, modern Palestinian identity was formed in 1948, and a big part of the experience is the experience of displacement in 1948. And therefore, we have to also rewrite our own history. None of these things are difficult, are easy. Unfortunately, in the negotiations, and I think this is one of our biggest mistakes as negotiators, Palestinians, Israelis, as well as the world that was helping us, is that we never truly dealt with these intangibles. We never dealt with them head on. We never sat down and said, you know what? As a Palestinian asking you as an Israeli to divide Jerusalem, I know it's very hard. And would it be easier if I go to you and say, publicly, I know your commitment to the Jerusalem, I know what it means to you, and I know how much pain you are going to incur when you make that concession. Sometimes acknowledging someone's pain makes it so much easier to make painful decisions. And similarly for us, if the Israelis were come to say, you know what, we know that you have to give up the right of return, and you know how hard it is for you because we know the suffering that your people went through back in 1948. We never address these issues. And I believe any future negotiation has to address these intangibles. Without addressing these intangibles, it's very hard to see how we can move beyond, we can maybe sign a peace deal, but we will not have peace without addressing these kind of questions. In terms of Hamas, I would say very, very quickly. I mean, it'd be an exaggeration to say I have no problem with Hamas, but I can live with Hamas if Hamas meets certain conditions. I can live with Hamas if Hamas decides that it's going to disarm, genuinely disarm. Because I believe guns and politics just don't really mix well. Don't believe me, look at Hezbollah in Lebanon, look at so many other experiences in the region. I can live with Hamas if Hamas says, I believe in a two-state solution. Ultimately, if it says our objective as a Palestinian state is to be a state next to Israel. I cannot live with Hamas if it says our objective is to destroy Israel, which A, is impossible, B, is immoral, C, will ensure that the Palestinian condition will remain under occupation forever, because why would the Israelis end the occupation if the objective is to destroy them ultimately? So if Hamas meets these conditions, I can live with it. I will never vote for him. There will always be my political foe. However, Hamas so far has shown no indication whatsoever that it's willing to do that. And until it does that, I believe it has no place whatsoever in the future of the region. It's a spoiler that has to be dealt with like any spoiler has to be dealt with, a combination of security means to deal with their terror activities, but also the importance of creating a compelling alternative to Hamas. I'm often reminded when I talk about Hamas of that old dad joke. If you're being chased by a shark, you don't have to swim faster than the shark. You have to swim faster than the next guy. And in this particular case, the next guy is the Palestinian Authority. As I said, corrupt, inefficient, unpopular. Unless you can create a compelling alternative to Hamas or something like Hamas will always emerge.
We've got that I want to ask you. First would be, do you have some advice for the Trump administration? Going into a pretty complex situation, what advice would you give them? Second question, looking at some of the discussion of ideas for the future of Gaza that's coming from the Trump administration, what's your sense of how these ideas of a resort are impacting the Palestinian people?
I mean, look, it's a very difficult question. I mean, we talked about transitions. The title of this talk is Transitions. I have not addressed the biggest transition, what we're having here in this country. Today, one of the challenges, I actually cannot tell you what the Trump administration stands for, because I see two very different strands in this administration. I see some who are coming basically from the traditional foreign policy world. You might agree or disagree with their positions. At the end of the day, they won the elections and, they get to rule. People like Rubio, State Department, people like Waltz at the National Security Council, and some of the others. These are people who actually believe that America has a role in the world. You can debate with them, whether you agree with the role, whether you agree with the methodology, etc. But these are people that you can engage in a conversation basically on the same grounds. But there are voices in the Trump administration that actually are purely isolationist. Voices that do not want the United States to play a role in the world. Voices that, in my view, believe that we can still get the advantage of being the world's superpower without acting like the world's superpower. Very transactional in ways that, that basically might make sense in the very, very short term, but take no account of the complexity and the interdependence of the international system. So the first piece of advice I would give to the Trump administration, figure out who you are. And until that happens, very hard for me to give them advice, more importantly, obviously, because who cares about me, very hard for foreign leaders to come and engage this administration. The most common question I get from Arab leaders, Arab officials who talk to me, and I've been getting a lot of calls from the region in the last few weeks, is who do we talk to in the Trump administration? Is it those guys or is it those guys? I have no answer. Two, Once you figure out who you are, make sure you have the right staff. Sounds very, very petty, right? It's not. If you do not have people who know the region, this is a complex region, okay? I mean, if you leave anything from this talk, leave with the sense that this is a very complex region. If you don't know it, there are so many pitfalls that you are bound to get into. So make sure that you have staff that are right. And in this regard, one of the beauties, I think, of the American system, what makes it so flexible, robust, etc., is the fact that we have this political appointee system where people who represent the view of the president are in government. However, the backbone of the system are the professionals. If you got the State Department, if you got our international community, our intelligence community, if you start removing some of the tools of power that we have, like USAID, like our alliances, whether it's cross-Atlantic or other alliances, if you deny yourself the tools, then you're not going to be able to be effective. So these may sound like very, very basic questions, but these are the things that are right now on my mind. Figure out who you are, staff up, and do not destroy your own tools, whether tools of influence or tools of decision-making. The Trump ideas, honestly, they're not really creating any, among the Palestinian public, they're seen as so outlandish that no one is really taking them too seriously. And frankly, for the people of Gaza today, let's just say they're worried more about where is the next loaf of bread is going to coming from, and where is the next bomb not coming from. That's really on their minds. No one's really thinking about it. The one thing that had an impact on is the Palestinian Authority itself. We saw the Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, try to kind of react in a positive way by making some because he knows that he will be under pressure to reform. So he's trying to preempt it by doing some very cosmetic issues. And a key question for us in the United States here is, as we engage with the Palestinian arena, is do we know it enough to know what part is bluff and what part is serious? Again, I say this because, I know some of the folks in the administration. These are very, very good folks, but unless they are properly staffed, they might be missing some very nuanced things that you will miss unless you are a deep expert on the topic.
You mentioned that you'd rather have the U.S. involved than Russia or China. Could you talk a little more about that? Like, what would involvement with those countries be like compared to the U.S.? And also maybe comment a little on unity within the Arab world versus conflict between the different players.
Okay. Let me start with the easy one, unity in the Arab world. The biggest lie in modern history. I mean, it's very interesting. A lie is the mistake, okay? I don't believe that people who talk about Arab unity came at it from a place of malice, etc. They really believed it, and there are there are commonalities between Arabs: language, culture, religion, etc., etc. All of the above. The reality is, though, that Arab countries, like Arab region, like every other region, is composed of different countries. Each country has its own character, its own set of interests, etc. It's unfortunately one of the least integrated regions in the world. And we can do a lot in terms of integration among different Arab countries. But to come and talk about unity, I think that this does a disservice to the diversity that we have in the Arab world. And many people tell me, and I hear this from many people, they're saying, these Arab countries, these are artificial countries, they are not real, blah, blah, blah. They were created by the Brits and the French back in the after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. That might have been absolutely true and accurate 100 years ago. 100 years later, these identities have had the chance to form and to crystallize. And I think, again, it does a disservice to these identities, to these nations, to basically say, oh, you're just all one undifferentiated mass. Recognize the differences, recognize the sovereignty, recognize the interest, and let's see how we can do more integration, whether it is economic integration, whether it is security integration, but without actually removing the specificity of every country, as we see in Europe today. If you push too much towards integration in ways that threaten national identities, you will create a backlash. And we don't want this in the Arab world. Why do you want the United States, not the Chinese? And by the way, when I say the Russians, I really mean the Chinese. The Russians are not a major power. The Russians are a weak economic power. Their military performance in Ukraine is, let's just say, not stellar. Their vaunted S-300 air defense systems did not scratch a single Israeli fighter jet that destroyed them all in Iran. So really, I'm talking about China. First of all, I would argue that the US has a much better product to give the region than the Chinese product, certainly in military terms, but also in kind of technology and communication terms. Huawei is not as good as some of what we have to offer, nor are there drones or fighter jets. Two, the Chinese actually bring a degree of corruption in their interaction that is unparalleled. Since this is being broadcast, I'm not going to mention from which country, but I was talking to an Arab official a few months ago. His country bought, he's a military guy, his country bought some drones from the Chinese. Then they had to ground these drones and later on had to break the contract. And I asked him, why did you break the contract? He said, first of all, the drones were bad quality. I mean, he used less polite terms, but to the effect that the drones were bad quality. But more importantly, he said to me, after that, we did an audit, and we had to fire half of our procurement department because the Chinese come and corrupt. And by the way, the guy was, this is not a kind of a green dreamer coming out of college. He said, of course there's going to be corruption, but within reason. They crossed that reason. 3, debt traps. They come in, we come in and give assistance. They come in and give loans. This might not be a problem for Saudi or the UAE. It's a problem of the poorer country. We're seeing it right now in Africa in particular, but some in Asia as well. They come in, give you a loan, and then they want the loan back. You cannot pay it back, so they start taking your national assets. In addition to the fact that I do believe, despite all of the kind of anxiety and tension and dysfunction in this country, our values are still superior to the Chinese values. Much as we can criticize this country, we're not doing genocide like what they're doing with the Uyghurs there. Okay, how is that for a start? So from my mind, for all of these reasons, in addition to the fact that the Chinese and those others are really unreliable when it comes to defending their allies, we're not terribly reliable, but we're certainly more reliable than they are. So for all of the above, this is kind of where, I mean, by the way, you're saying like the bar is so low. One thing that I have learned early on in my career, in foreign policy and in policy in general, your choices are never brilliant, excellent, and good. They're tragic, awful, and not too bad. And when you get to the not too bad, it's actually you're doing pretty good in a policy term, and this is the word that we're operating within.
All right, so you partially answered it there, and the Chinese would do worse. But my question is, it seems as if I'm 45 years old or 44 years old, and it seems like you dated this to 1979, and U.S. involvement in the Middle East has just been catastrophe after catastrophe after catastrophe. Iran-Contra, the CIA funding bin Laden, and obviously 9/11, weapons of mass destruction. You mentioned Syria is being controlled as we speak by al-Qaeda and bin Ladenites, who we should forsake for obvious reasons, yet you want more American involvement. Is there any reason to expect American involvement there to have any good repercussions at all, aside from then the Chinese and Russians won't be there?
You mentioned, and I think it's natural when we look at our failures in the region to highlight those. And by the way, I can maybe disagree on a detail here and a detail there, but also there have been successes in our engagement. Be it, frankly, the relative stability that we've had in that region for quite a while, since 1979, the Carter Doctrine. Be it the fact that actually this policy, with a lot of mistakes, ended up staving off the Soviet and the communist attempt to take over that region. Be it the creation of peace treaties between Israel and Jordan and Egypt that have been very stable cornerstones of the security architecture in that region. So as much as we have failures, we have also had interests. These interests have accrued to some of the countries that are within our orbit, but also to our own benefit. Stability there in terms of whether it is oil supply, whether it is navigation, freedom of navigation, again, countering communism, are all benefits that we had. I think we have to re-question and re-examine how we engage. I think, for example, if you look at the Iraq War, we overreached. We overreached because we thought that we can go and make them like us. Very, very shallow, very superficial question. They don't want to be like us. They have their own concept of how they want to live. Again, I go to the Emirates, for example, today, and they're very clear to me. They said, we have a country that we're very happy with. Actually, the happiest people, if you look at some of the polls after the kind of, Danes and the Norwegians, are the Emiratis. We tried to impose our value system on a region that was not particularly interested in our value system. 2, we never really understood how you build alliances. We always mistook leadership with monopoly. And in that sense, we did not create space, whether for some of these countries to come and play their own role, or to some of our other partners, Europeans and others, to come and play a role. So I do believe still that American leadership is something that will be to our interest and to the interest of the region, because I'm a believer that stability in that region right now is the highest premium. Yet I do believe we have to re-examine what our role is, what our objectives are, and what our tools are in order to achieve that objective.
My question is regarding how much of Netanyahu's career is tied to the conflict happening right now in Gaza. I feel like every time I turn on NPR, they're saying that the end of the conflict in Gaza is going to be social suicide, or political suicide, I should say, for Netanyahu. And how much of this conflict, if any, is being prolonged by his push to hold power, and when the conflict does end, does he have a political career?
Let me start by saying, start with a joke. We say in our business that a cat has Netanyahu lives. The guy is a political magician. He has been written off so many times. He has a way to come back. So I would not write him off, and I would not venture to basically write his political eulogy at this moment. Yet what is very clear is that he has cornered himself politically in a position in which he is completely reliant right now on parties which are, the word hard right does not do it justice. These are racist parties that promote terrorism. And I use these terminologies very, very advisedly. A person like Smotrich, who's his finance minister, whose views, which are not implicit, explicit. He wrote a bloody thing about it in 2017. Go back and read it. Is all about, we go to the Palestinians, and either they accept being residents with no rights whatsoever, and if they don't, we offer them to leave, and if they don't want to leave, we shoot them. I'm not paraphrasing, I'm quoting. Bibi, that's Benjamin Netanyahu, moved to that position because he burned so many bridges with so many other political actors, because he's someone who is highly untrustworthy in political life, that right now he is completely reliant on this. When I said early on about moving to phase 2, as I mentioned, the military, maybe I didn't mention it, I can't remember, the military in Israel believes that right now resuming the war simply will not produce any more results. This is no longer a military action, this is an insurgency, and it requires a very, very different strategy to approach it. The reason why he's unwilling to move in that direction is because he's afraid that if he says that, Smotrich and others in his coalition are going to bolt and his government is going to collapse. So I do not, and I think it's very unadvisable in our business to try to go into someone's head. But if you look purely at the political calculation, to my mind, politics is at least a partial contributor to the continuation of the war. Personally, and I will do exactly what I said I was not going to do, but I will do it nevertheless, is I do believe that Bibi right now has gone to the end of his political career. Much of what he's been doing since October 7th is trying to avoid taking responsibility for October 7th. At the end of the day, it happened on his watch. At the end of the day, the buck stops there. I do believe that Israel ultimately is going to end up with a commission of inquiry that ultimately will have to say whether or not the prime minister knew the details. He was in charge. When you're the prime minister, you get the benefit of success, but you also have the responsibility of failures. Who's going to come after him? Very, very hard to tell. Israel has moved to the right. That's a fact. Israel, after October 7th, has moved further to the right. Highly, highly understandable. I would say, though, maybe I'll take your question and pivot to a different direction slightly with it. Putting it like this, politics, because again, Israeli politics is way too complicated. I would say the following, though. I believe the Israelis and the Palestinians, as of yet, have not started grappling with the implications of October 7th and of the war that came after that. The Israelis are still living on October 8th. Whenever I go to Israel, what I see reinforces its images of the fallen in October 7th, the hostages, dead soldiers. Hamas kept on reminding them of October 7th every Saturday when they're releasing hostages in this shameful theater that they were doing. And the Palestinians, the war is not over. We still have not even started grappling with the enormity of what happened. 50,000 people, almost 50,000 people. Many of them were Hamas, many of them were not Hamas. This is the biggest tragedy that happened to us as a nation since 1948, maybe even worse than 1948. We have not started grappling with it yet. I say this partly because to just give you a sense of how long these societies will need to heal, to be able to move forward, to be able to even process their own pain before they start looking at the other side's pain. But I also say it for a political reason. Major political upheavals and major political failures of this sort always create political change. You look at the trajectory, for example, trajectory of Israeli politics. 1973, the failure in the Yom Kippur War, the Ramadan War, as we call it, basically led to the break of the monopoly of the Labour Party on Israeli politics and the rise of the Likud as a ruling party. Today, October 7th was not only a failure of Bibi, it was a failure of a ruling elite. And I suspect that Israeli politics, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, will look very, very different from the Israeli politics that we know. We also have to go through our own internal thing. Unfortunately, and I say this is really unfortunate, we have yet, as Palestinians, and I would say even as a wider Arab community, gotten into any serious major public conversation about the morality of what happened on October 7th. Many people are criticizing October 7th as, unwise, wrong, it brought disaster on us. We are yet to internalize and come to grips and debate, is it moral to go into someone's home and kill them in their bedroom? So all of these questions have to be grappled until they're grappled, and once they're answered, they will produce major shocks in these systems. Initially, I will see a hardening of positions, but give it 5, 6, 7, 8 years, it can go in very, very unpredictable places that I today cannot even start guessing where they go.
Hello. Thank you for your time this evening. I have a two-part question. So from your perspective, who is Iran's number one enemy, And then the second part is President Trump has started negotiations with Russia to be the mediator for Iran's disarmament of nuclear power. Wondering what your thoughts are on that.
The second one is one that I actually, it's quite easy. You don't bring an Iranian ally to be the mediator when it comes to Iran. Russia has been dependent on Iranian drones in Ukraine. Russia has been the supplier of a lot of military hardware, technology, as well as intelligence to Iran. Let's just say this is not the kind of mediator I want to come and convince Iran to start behaving, let's say, responsibly when it comes to that. I think it's a disaster. I think it's a huge, big mistake. And I do hope that, again, once things settle, because I know, people like Rubio, people like Waltz would be very uncomfortable with this. And once you have a process, it's very hard to see how the professionals in our system would recommend going in that direction. Iran's biggest enemies, I mean, I wouldn't actually phrase it in this term, because there are a lot of enemies. You know, Israel is obviously a big enemy, and one that has imposed a lot of cost on Iran. Saudi Arabia is a big enemy, and the enmity goes even before Islam. You know, a lot of people talk about the Sunni-Shia divide. I think that's wrong. The Arab-Persian is even older and deeper. But this is, I think, the framework I would use is very different. It's quite different. I would look at the framework, the analytical one today. I would say Iran represents a certain way and a certain vision of how do you project power and how do you achieve national interest. And from their perspective, instability and destabilization is how you achieve your national interest. And it has worked for them. Whenever there is something unstable, they come in, insert themselves, and become more popular, become stronger. Think Lebanon, a failed state but by name. They come in, they have a foothold. Iraq, after the invasion of Iraq, we so mismanaged it that the Iranians found a way to come in. Yemen with the civil war, they come and support the Houthis. And even when there is no instability, they try to create instability. Over the last year, a bit more, they've been trying really hard to destabilize Jordan, to get a foothold there. So that's kind of one camp. And one camp, really a camp of one, with some vessels around it, Iran. The other camp is a camp that sees that their national interests are being served through stability and integration. Here, I would throw the Gulf states, Jordan, Egypt, etc. It's a loose camp, and there's not particularly very cohesive, but its view is the more stability, the less there is, the better it is for us as governments and as countries. So this is the competition that I see. Today, the leader of the stabilization camp is Saudi Arabia. But key actors are United Arab Emirates, because they are the trailblazers, and Jordan, because it's the kind of security linchpin of that whole regime. So these three, I would argue, are the main enemies of Iran, of course, in addition to Israel, which is a totally different conversation.
Let's thank Ghaith for leading us in this conversation. Amazing. Thank you.
By the way, can I just conclude on one?
Sure.
If I may just keep you for one couple of minutes. Now, I've been in enough talks in my life to know that most of you will probably forget 95% of what I said by next week, which is totally fine. I hope that you leave this with at least one or 2 points that will stick in your minds. One is the idea that the Middle East is complicated, and unless you approach it as a complicated issue, you will never get the diagnosis right, and therefore you'll never get the prescription right. Unless we understand that this is an area that's not a morality play, there are no quick fixes, no quick solutions, we will always get it wrong. So that's the one thing. And the second one, and I say this because I go on a lot of campuses and do these kinds of talks, and I'm very troubled by the idea that people can look at this from such one-sided ways. I believe this is a complex issue. I believe this is an issue that all actors, I look at my expertise, Palestinians and Israelis, both have a very, very good dose of justice on their side, and both have done so many nasty and stupid things to have so much injustice on their side. And unless you can look at it, recognizing this, unless you can look at it in a way that looks at the complexity in an analytical way, and most importantly, unless we look at it in ways that look for ways of facing challenges and overcoming them and seizing opportunities and benefit from them, unless we look at it from a solution-oriented lens, I fear that we will only be contributing to the continuation of those conflicts, will only be contributing to the suffering that every person in that region, Israeli, Palestinian, Egyptian, Jordanian, etc., we become a contributor factor to prolonging their own suffering. So if you leave something out of this, please leave with the impression and the sense that we can find solutions. There are difficult problems, but unless we approach them from a solution-oriented approach, we will be part of the problem, not part of the solution. With this, thank you so very much for spending the time. It was an honor.
Thank you again. Awesome. Quite an evening. Thank you, Ghaith. And I'm sorry you couldn't get all the questions in. If you had one you didn't get a chance to ask, come on up here and I'm sure he'd be happy to engage with you. Next week, we're going to be to India. We'll be talking about India-U.S. relations with Rick Grasso, who is a graduate of Grand Valley State University, by the way, and a very, very, very respected India-U.S. expert from CSIS in Washington, D.C. So come back again, same time, same place next week. Thank you.